Have you heard about the time Didier Drogba stopped the civil war? On the 19th of September 2002, the Ivory Coast was plunged into a long and bloody civil war. While the conflict raged on, the one thing which offered the country hope was football, particularly as the country looked ahead to the 2006 World Cup, a competition which they had never qualified for. So how did Didier Drogba and Les Elephants use football for peace? The World Cup qualification saw the Ivory Coast drawn in Group 3 alongside Cameroon, Egypt, Libya, Sudan and Benin. Samuel Eto'o's Cameroon were widely considered favourites to progress to the World Cup, and going into the final match day the dream was all but over for the Ivorians, as the Ivory Coast sat in second place on 19 points, a point behind Cameroon. In order for Les Elephants to go to the World Cup, they would have to go away to Sudan and win, while also relying on Cameroon dropping points at home to Egypt. Ivory Coast, knowing nothing less than a victory would do, made short work of a Sudanese side second bottom in the group. The Cameroonians were facing more difficulty. Cameroon took the lead in the 20th minute, but the game was tight. A 79th minute equaliser bundled in by Mohamed Shawki brought Egypt level and swung the tide back in the Ivorians' favour. A draw would see them qualify, and with just seconds remaining in Yaoundé, Ivory Coast looked set for their maiden trip to the World Cup. Their match in Sudan was finished by this stage, and Drogba was standing surrounded by his teammates, all listening to the radio and waiting. Then the crushing news filtered through. Cameroon had been awarded a soft penalty in the 4th minute of injury time. With Ivorian hopes crushed, Pierre Wome stepped up to the spot to take a penalty that would send Cameroon to the World Cup for the 5th time running. But he missed, and after 7 attempts the Ivorians had made it to the World Cup for the first time in their history. All around the Ivory Coast was jubilation, but none of those scenes could match what was happening in the team's dressing room. Back in Sudan, Drogba called in the media, and with all Ivorian eyes on their television screens, he grabbed a microphone and delivered a heartfelt plea to the millions of Ivorians watching. Ivorians on both sides of the conflict. For one night at least, the Ivory Coast, a war zone, rejoiced. There was even a Congo line outside the Egyptian embassy to thank them for their heroics in Cameroon. But despite the temporary joy, the country remained deeply divided, and this was only the first step towards peace. Drogba's speech was replayed on national television multiple times, hoping the sheer force of exposure could bring change. And slowly change did come. Both sides moved closer to the negotiation table, and a ceasefire was finally signed. A few years later, as tensions were rising for the second time, Drogba once again stepped up during a tour of the rebel-held area of his homeland. Here he announced that the Ivory Coast home match against Madagascar, which had been scheduled to be played in the government-held south, would instead be played in Bouaké, the symbolic centre of the revolution. On the pitch, the Ivorians knew what this match meant and truly delivered. The goals flew in, with the scoring started by Kalou in the 18th minute and ended predictably by Drogba, who notched the 5th in the 86th minute. The symbolic gesture of playing the game in Bouaké seemed to have united the country once again, and it did for a time. Following the match, a peace agreement was signed and the disarmament process began. The hostilities unfortunately flared up again 5 years later, but for a time, Drogba and the national team brought hope and peace to a divided country.